Hi, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. We're in the Exemplary Catholic Leaders series, and my guest today is Brian Holdsworth. You may have heard of him. He's quite a famous podcaster, and so I'm really pleased that Brian is with us today. And before we get back to Brian, I just wanted to mention quickly that we have at the Catholic CEO many services and offerings that you might be interested in. So check us out at thecatholicceo.com. Also, one of our projects, thecatholiceconomy.com, is something that you might be interested in as a place where Catholics can come together and promote each other's businesses and do business with each other. So, and I'm happy that Brian, that you're with us today. How's it going today?
It's going pretty well. I've been a little under the weather, so if I sound a little croaky, that might be why. But otherwise, I can't complain. It's great to be with you, Henry.
That's great. Well, thanks again, Brian, for coming on board with this. So interested, people are in this series. We're trying to show exemplary Catholic leaders, people who are living a Catholic life and who are publicly, through their businesses or their apostolates, visibly living that Catholic faith. And so one of the most interesting questions people ask us is where are you in your faith journey? So Brian, where are you and how did it come about that you're a Catholic and that you're doing the work that you do? What is your faith journey?
Okay, well, it's hard to know where to pinpoint that. That could be in an entire autobiography, I suppose, because for those of us that are attentive to our experience and especially our conversion process, it could go all the way back to childhood. And in my case, it probably does. Well, it certainly does in a sacramental sense, because when I was an infant, I was baptized. Although my parents weren't really practicing. Well, they attended a mainline Protestant church called the United Church here in Canada, which was sort of an amalgamation of, I don't even know which denominations, but I think like the Presbyterians and the Methodists and maybe a few others. But they were for the longest time the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, and that made them the second largest Christian denomination next to the Catholic Church. So that's my family's heritage going all the way back a few generations. And so naturally my parents had me baptized, and I do have some memories of attending the United Church when I was really little, but it was sporadic. And I think the level of enthusiasm from my parents was quite low. My dad would have described himself as an atheist at the time. And then my mom, I think she was quite earnest about wanting to be a church-going person, but I don't know what the measure of her faith would have necessarily been. But nonetheless, there was grace there. There was the sacrament that I received as a child, and some initial exposure to notions of Christianity, I suppose. But my parents split up when I was still quite young, and at that point, whatever enthusiasm my mom still had for the idea of church or Christianity dissolved along with their marriage. And that left me orphaned in more than just a familial sense, but also in terms of, I think the things that my parents believed were sort of the moral anchors of their lives. They became somewhat disillusioned with through this what was obviously a catastrophic failure in their own lives. And so we were left drifting as a family, like both my parents and then my brothers and I as well. And for the most part, I would say raised like agnostic, neo-pagan, just floating with the currents of the culture around us. But I always had a suspicion that there was something more to this sort of veil of the material world. And I was cautious around questions of God. I wasn't the kind of person who would easily profane the name of God or anything that might be considered sacred by other people. I was certainly cautious about that kind of thing. So there was maybe a measure of interest, of curiosity, but not enough of a willingness to explore where that goes until around the time I was about 19 years old. And I had met some people who were very enthusiastic about their faith, and they invited me to a Bible study that was hosted by the mother of a friend that I'd gone to high school with. And her witness and her life were unlike anything else I'd ever really encountered. She was somebody who was clearly at peace with herself and the world around her. She had a kind of self-confidence that is a trait that I wanted for myself. I always wanted to be somebody who, could be confident, could inspire confidence in other people, especially about myself. But I didn't really understand what a healthy version of that looked like. That wasn't arrogance, because which isn't something that a lot of people are drawn to or inspired by. But she seemed to have this quality, and the longer I spent time with her and their family, the more I got to know them, the more I realized that the source of that was actually a kind of a humility. It was a confidence that she was loved, and an enthusiasm for the people that were around her, rather than being self-conscious and fixated on the self. And so that inspired me to want to learn more about what it was that gave her this sense of confidence and simultaneously humility, and the ability to look at the people around you, or to interact with people around you without being too hung up on yourself. And for me, that the conclusion that I drew was that it was her faith. It was grace. It was, her relationship with God that gave her this sense of confidence. And so that sent me exploring the question of God, that I had always left unanswered or unaddressed. And for me, that was a question of prayer. That was, well, if God exists, I should just go straight to the source. And so that's what I did. I prayed to God. I said, if you're out there, it's sort of a very cliched scenario, right? Like, give me a sign, tell me who you are.
Sure.
And to whatever degree I needed that question answered, it was to a satisfying degree for me. I'm not somebody who has a very charismatic or a supernatural faith, but that was probably a mystical experience for me, was that sort of encounter with God. And that convinced me to continue to explore where that leads. And to make an already long story a little bit shorter, that sent me into churches, attending different churches, reading about church history, reading about the Catholic Church's claims to being the church that Jesus founded, reading Protestant claims to the contrary, and then also reading scripture as well. And eventually I found what I was reading in scripture, what I was reading about church history, and then when I was reading the sort of competing claims, I found that the claims of the Catholic Church made the most sense to me. Even though I didn't really want that one to be the correct one. There were evangelical communities and Protestant communities that I could just show up and join, right? It was just a matter of sort of signing on the dotted line. Whereas with the Catholic Church, there was a lot of intimidation. There was a lot of a lack of familiarity for me as I approached it. I didn't really understand the Mass or the liturgy or how to participate in it well. And there was this whole process of initiation, of having to go through a Christian initiation and catechesis and being qualified and scrutinized to some degree. But I was convinced that it was true. And so I went through all of that process and was eventually initiated as an adult into the Catholic Church. So that's my conversion story. For whatever reason, for as long as I've been Catholic, and even prior to becoming Catholic, I've always found myself given opportunities for leadership. So I'm a musician, I play guitar, I can sing a little bit. And the youth ministry coordinator at the parish I was being initiated into recruited me to help out with music at Mass at the time, even before I was Catholic. And so I said, sure, okay, let's do that. And those kinds of opportunities never really abated. They were constantly there. And I found myself, there were times where I had to back away and focus on family or my personal life, professional life. But for the most part, these opportunities kept persisting. And I just found myself being willing to pursue them and explore where they went. So that's, I don't know, that's.
Well, yes, it's very interesting. Thanks for telling us that. Some people come through a kind of an intellectual pursuit approach. They read and they study and by logic and kind of by observation, they learn through the intellectual process about the Catholic faith. And yours, I can sense there was some of that there. You did a lot of readings and studies, but you also went and experienced other, denominations, let's say,
Yeah.
and this friend of yours at the beginning influenced you by that kind of that sense of peace and serenity, which came from faith. So would you say that it's I guess it sounds to me like it's a combination of intellectual and personal experience that brought you to the faith?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's kind of phases of conversion for me. I would say that my conversion towards theism, to becoming convinced that there is a God, it's a personal reality, that he knows who I am and he cares about me, and I'm supposed to have some sort of ongoing interaction with that deity. That was very much a personal, experiential conversion. But then what do I do with that? Once I became convinced of that, and I was convinced that Jesus was part of that equation, but I didn't understand, Christology or theology around the Blessed Trinity or anything like that. Just that, he might have been God's spokesperson for all I knew. Getting from theism to Catholicism was much more intellectual endeavor, where I felt like I had to understand it. And yes, I did go to churches, but what motivated that was a desire to want to understand this thing that I was adopting. So, okay, if I'm going to become a Christian, what does that look like? How am I supposed to live my life? Do I have to go to church? And in going to church, I was expecting to sit down and listen on a Sunday, hear a good sermon, and have that explained to me. And what I found was that more often I was left confused and frustrated by that experience, because I didn't feel like I was having those questions answered, or at least consistently in a coherent way. And so that forced me to take a step back and start to learn a little bit more, do some more self-study, both scripture, church history, and just other sort of apologetic books that helped me kind of untangle all of that.
Right. And so it's very interesting how this works with people. And in your life, then one of the questions that it struck me just a moment ago, that, what should I do with this? What am I supposed to do with this? And so, those who know you as a somewhat public figure would say that, well, what you're doing with it is you're exposing your Catholic faith. You're a broadcaster in a regular sense, and you are putting out there, you're commenting on issues of the day, and you're also putting out your faith. How did that manifest itself? Was that something that came to you in a flash, or was that a gradual growth?
The specific me publishing on the internet and doing this podcast?
Yes.
Well, as I said, I always found myself in these positions where I had opportunities to participate in some sort of mode of service within sort of the apostolic life of the church. As far as what I'm doing right now, that really ties into my professional work. So I work in branding and marketing and web design and graphic design, and I have a range of clients that fit particular services, or perhaps the whole range of services. But one particular request we were getting a lot, especially with our web design clients, was, can we make videos for our website? And I thought, well, I don't really know videography that well. I know a little bit about cameras, and I know how to use graphic design software, and video editing software kind of fits into that. But I wouldn't be willing to get paid for it, because I'm not that fluent in it. So I decided to learn that. And I did. I looked up all the tutorials online. I bought the equipment. I made some videos for fun, and got to the degree where I felt like, yeah, this is now something we can offer to clients. But until I'm getting a regular stream of projects related to that, I'm going to have to find a way to maintain my discipline and my skill in this aspect of our service offering. And so a YouTube channel seemed like a good way to maintain that practice. And I thought, well, I like YouTube, but I don't know what I would do for a channel, or what would be worth setting up. But I did also simultaneously have in my personal folders, just on my computer, a folder full of essays that I had written, because I'm also the kind of person who, I'll get an idea and I'll think, well, that's really interesting, but I don't want it to just dissolve into the ether of my sort of cerebral memory. So I'll tend to write them down and then revisit them and think, oh, okay, yeah, so that makes sense. And so I have this library of stuff that I'd been writing, and I thought, well, this might actually work to do some commentaries with some of these. But I was apprehensive to do it. I didn't I felt like it would be putting myself out there in a pretty bold way that that people would judge me for that, and I didn't really want to try and shine a spotlight on myself. So I procrastinated on that. I had this idea, I had the equipment, I was pretty much ready to go, but I didn't really want to do it. I was more embarrassed than anything. But this was around the time that here in Canada, we were having the debate around legalized assisted suicide and euthanasia.
Yes.
And I had gone out for a lunch break and was driving back to my office, and I was listening to CBC radio. So for anybody who isn't Canadian, CBC is like our public broadcaster, like the BBC is in the UK. And they were having this conversation, although it wasn't a conversation, it was a one-sided depiction of the pro-euthanasia side of this debate. And so I listened to this and I got so frustrated with it that I got back to my office and I turned the camera on and I ranted for about 20 minutes.
Excellent.
Just as a cathartic thing, right? To get it off my chest. And afterwards, I went back and watched it and I thought, that wasn't too bad, actually. Maybe I could do this with a little more polish and a little more, a little more preparation. And so I did. I redid that video and a few others that were I thought would be interesting ones to start off with, and again, fully expecting that this was going to be more a personal project to practice videography, and maybe I would get a few hundred views here or there, just as the token gift that YouTube dangles in front of you to keep you publishing on their platform.
Reward.
Exactly. Yeah. And then something kind of funny happened, which was that somebody had ripped one of the videos off of my YouTube channel and posted it on their Facebook page. And they ended up getting like 500,000 views on it. And up until this point, I thought, I don't know if anybody really wants to listen to what I have to say or would care what I have to say. But then when I saw this thing go semi-viral on somebody else's page, I thought, wow, so some people do have an interest in what I have to say. So it was at that point I took it a little more seriously and invested more effort into it. And more consistency into it, and it just grew from there, which has been an ongoing discernment for me because it wasn't something I was really prepared for. But now that it has happened, it's something where I'm routinely revisiting the question: what do I do with this? How should I continue to promote this? Should I try to get this to grow? Should I drift away from my professional life and focus more energy on this? And that's where I find myself today, still trying to answer those questions.
Trying to figure it out, still trying to balance it all. So, Brian, you have a following out there, and in some ways it might be tough to pin down. Is your background, your economic background, theology or philosophy or anything like that? Or are you a commentator on public affairs that showcases your Catholic faith?
Yeah, so certainly my instinct is towards the latter, although it's virtually impossible to have a sort of a full-throated conversation around that without introducing philosophy and theology to some degree. As I do so, though, I don't consider myself like a catechist. I don't consider myself somebody who's going to teach you the theology of the Catholic Church necessarily, but to offer some thoughts about theology that I've encountered that I find compelling or convincing, or questions that are somewhat open-ended within the life of the Church today, and direction or maybe answers to some of those open-ended questions that I have found to be really helpful for me in my own devotional life, my own piety, my own attempts to grow in holiness and grace and to nurture that gift of faith that I've been given. So it's very much sort of like I'm a lay person, I'm a pew sitting person who does find myself in positions of, let's say, leadership or service within the church, who is trying to make sense of it and share some of the insights that I feel like I found along the way.
And that's very interesting, Brian. You've mentioned a service, a life of service. Liturgy has been something that I've heard you comment about recently in various of your broadcasts. And, I think that you attend the traditional Latin Mass, as I do myself, in Calgary and Vancouver. And you are you're in Edmonton. And so, what about the journey towards that liturgy, that approach to worship? What were some thoughts from you on that?
Well, as I said earlier, even before being initiated into the Catholic Church, I had been recruited to do music at the mass that I was attending.
Yes.
And I eventually, so I was recruited initially as the electric guitarist, the very prestigious,
Good for you.
essential role within a Catholic choir, right?
Yes,
And
exactly.
but eventually, I was able to take over the music ministry for that particular liturgy, leading sort of a band and in a youth ministry style. And one thing that has always been important to me as a convert is um, trying to proclaim this faith to the world in some way that is going to be well received. And that's because, you know, I came away from a culture, both family and friends and community, who didn't follow me. They didn't have the same experience of encountering God. And as a result, I'm left really wanting them to have that same experience out of genuine concern and love for their well-being, right? I think Trent Horn said something in one of his books like, how much would you have to hate people to not tell them about this gift of eternal life that we've been given and this hope of salvation, right? So, and I mean, that's a rhetorically profound way of I think identifying this urge that I've always had to try and do whatever I can to draw people into this faith. And so when early on in my conversion, that meant music ministry, and that meant trying to make this liturgy that I was participating in as attractive as possible. But as I did so, well, first of all, I wasn't well catechized. I didn't understand, you know, the history of liturgy. And I didn't understand how best that we could do that and what authentic Catholic culture really looked like. So I was just doing what I knew how to do, which was play the guitar and sing praise and worship.
Yes.
But what I found was even with that very sort of culturally palatable approach, there's a lot of apathy and indifferentism surrounding a lot of this kind of work within the church. People just they didn't care. They kind of came in and they left every Sunday. And, you know, whether or not other people adopted the faith themselves was sort of like, yeah, whatever, it's not that big a deal. If you've got your thing, maybe you're Protestant or maybe you're agnostic, you know, God loves us all. And so it's not that critical. I could never really adopt that sort of apathetical attitude towards it. And so for me, the first thing that was obvious to me was that we need to do everything we can to make the faith as attractive to people as possible. And as I grew in maturity, hopefully that's what it was maturing in my faith. I came to appreciate that, you know, this approach that I had always thought would be one way of doing it was kind of fraught with a lot of problems. It didn't create the enthusiasm among non-Catholics that you thought it might, in part because in many respects, we're just reflecting the culture that they already possess back to them. But we're kind of twisting it to be sort of Catholic, right? Like the content is the same, but the accidents of it, you know, the style of music, the drumming, the guitars, the singing, all of this kind of stuff. These are songs and song compositions that they could already get on secular radio at a much higher degree, without having to make the sacrifices that one has to make to, you know, go to church on Sunday, or the kind of sacrifices I had to make to be initiated into the Catholic Church. So what is it about this faith that we could offer them that would compel them to want to explore something that's actually unique to the Catholic Church? And the more I wrestled with those kinds of questions, the more I found myself being attracted to, I suppose, the ancient expression of the church, which isn't something you can get on secular radio, isn't something you can get at the bar at an open mic night or something like that, right? It's something that is wholly unique and frankly beautiful, and is consistent with our ideas of beauty, sort of this classical theistic understanding of who God is as objectively good and true and beautiful, whereas the music that and the art that is synonymous with the modern world and including the postmodern world is philosophically committed to the idea that there is no such thing as objective beauty. And that's reflected in our music, in our art, which is very relativistic, which is very determined and committed to chasing fashionable currents rather than something that is enduring. Whereas you can walk into a Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, a great Gothic cathedral going back to the Middle Ages, or you can listen to something like a Palestrina motet,
Yes.
that virtually anybody of all persuasions and all different tastes and backgrounds can listen to or look at and say, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Right?
Objectively so. Yeah.
Objectively so, right. And so, on the one hand, we could chase currents of culture which are constantly fluctuating and which we will always be behind the curve on, and which are only at best going to appeal to people's sense of fashion. Or we could utilize this ancient approach to beauty and to culture that is timeless and will always have a timeless appeal. And so those kinds of conclusions started to make a lot more sense to me, both intellectually and experientially, as I would encounter those kinds of expressions of beauty in my faith.
My own experience is I'm of an age, as you would imagine. I was in high school when all of the liturgical changes occurred, and I was attending a Jesuit boys' school in Regina.
Okay.
And I had, the contemporary kind of all these things that you've just articulated so well started to come about. And of course, we were swept along, you might say, in this movement, because there was really no alternative at the time that was really publicly known. It was like, switch off this and switch this on. And so I found myself for many years living, continuing to attend Mass and attending it in the new kind of approach to it all.
Yeah.
And then many years later, living in Calgary, we were sitting and the kids were at choir practice after Mass one Sunday, and I noticed in the bulletin that, there's Latin Mass. And so something happened. It switched me immediately. We went the following Sunday, and we've never changed. We've never come back, looked back from that moment. Yeah. But the truth and the beauty and the goodness of it is something that is very powerful, and it has had an effect. I can see it in children, my children, my grandchildren. They can see this inherent beauty of this. And so I was going to ask you then, in the course of your work, you have a vantage point. You see people, you get feedback, I'm sure, from people. So I'd like to ask you, what do we say to the young people, families today, raising children? Confirmation seems to be in many families a time when, there's that event goes by and then that's it, goodbye. You never see the child again in a church. And I'm not trying to create a straw man here, but what would you say to families from the work that you're doing in the public eye, hearing these comments? What would you say to people? Is there a formula, Brian? Can you say something to people about how do you keep this truth and beauty and goodness in front of your children at that awkward age in the teenagers when they might actually just depart from the visible, worship?
Yeah. So I was talking earlier about, my experience of wanting to proclaim the faith in a compelling way, right? And that's something that actually does have to be done. That's sort of an essential pattern within the life of the church. It's an incarnational system of belief that we have, an incarnational religion. The invisible God became incarnate, right? So that's this sort of pattern, is this constant revelation of what otherwise would be hard to grasp or hard to encounter. God is making it visible, audible, sensory for us, right?
Yes.
And so when it comes to the creed, in part your question is, how do we transmit this creed in such a way that it will be adopted by successive generations? And I would say that, some creeds aren't incarnational, but ours is. So unless you make that creed incarnational in some way for them, it's going to appear to be a dead thing that they're inheriting. And I would say that that's the big mistake that we've made over the 20th century as a church, whether deliberate or not. Maybe it's just something that happened kind of accidentally. I think there's a bit of that going on, but we took the incarnation of our faith, which is culture. Culture is the embodiment of religion, right?
Yes.
So if we take our culture, the things that had been built up over generations and generations. So some of the fixtures would be things like our unique sacred architecture, our unique sacred art, our unique sacred music, all of these things that are unique and sacred, if I can overuse those terms,
Yes. Yes.
That's the embodiment of our faith. And we've kind of stripped those things away. Like, how often do you go to your typical mass here in Canada, at least where I am, and hear something like Gregorian chant? I remember there was, in the diocesan newspaper, there was this story about a Gregorian chant mass that they were doing, as if this was some weird novel thing. And it's like, well,
Yes.
it shouldn't be. That's sort of an essential fixture of our liturgical heritage. But we've stripped those things away and then tried to fill them in with the culture of other creeds, sort of the incarnation of other creeds, right? Whether it be the secular world, like rock and roll and percussive music, or postmodern or modernist architecture, which do not have their origin in our creed or in our faith at all. Right. They come from without, and we're trying to adopt them in and to shoehorn them into expressions of our creed, which just doesn't work. I think one of the analogies I've used in the past is that that culture is to creed what words are to thoughts, right? So words are the incarnation or the embodiment of thoughts. If you're going to take somebody else's culture and the fixtures of that culture, like their music, like their architecture, like their art, or even their style of communication, and try to use that to express your creed, it's like using someone else's words to express your own thoughts, right? Like, just go find somebody who's having a conversation and take the exact content of their words and say, oh, I'm going to see if this will just express what it is that I'm thinking. Like, the odds of that working out are quite slim, obviously, right?
Exactly.
It's an incoherent thing to do. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to use our own words to express our own thoughts. We need to use our culture to express the content of our creed. That's going to be the only thing that is going to, first of all, be coherent, and second of all, actually attract people to this creed that it is that we are trying to pass on. Then I'd say the ancient expression and the timeless expression of our culture is one that has been shown demonstrably to be able to do that. There have been you can trace the vitality and the health of the church in certain periods of time. Well, through the ancient to the medieval and onward, there was a strength of vitality within the life of the church. For as long as we've adopted the culture that does not belong to the church and try to make it our own, we've seen significant decline. And so that seems to me to be an obvious opportunity for us to reclaim our own actual heritage and to put it to good use, such that successive generations will be drawn to it. And in my experience, with my own children, we used to go to the new form of the Mass for the longest time, and they were participating, but then when they encountered the Latin Mass for the first time, after we'd gone for a few weeks, I remember there was one Sunday where I wasn't convinced that we were going to keep going, and I didn't know what my kids were going to think of it. But I asked them, do you want to keep going to the Latin Mass, or do you want to go back to our old parish? And then our old parish is one where we had, familiarity and friends and community and all these things. We were the new people at this new community, and they unanimously and triumphantly, like with hands in the air. I remember this. We were driving, and I was looking in my rearview mirror at them as they responded to this question. They said, "The Latin Mass. We want the Latin Mass." And I just thought, I kind of looked at my wife, like, "Did you expect that?" And I don't think either of us did. But there's something about the authenticity of it, the richness of it, the sensory experience of it, and the very deliberate way that it is an attempt to proclaim and to make our faith a beautiful experience, rather than the complacency that I encounter so much at the new Mass and the parishes that promote it.
It's such a, I love your story, because I had a similar story in our own family. The children were observing certain things about contemporary worship, about even at that time, and they're 10, 15 years older than they were then, but even then they were noticing that if you attempt to become contemporary and popular, you could say, as a means to draw in people, and I'm not here to bash anybody, but it becomes you enter the race, then you have to then
Right.
keep up with contemporary, and so what's the latest thing, what's the newest thing, and that becomes lame in some
Yeah.
ways to listen to the words of the children that my children and others, nieces, nephews.
Yeah.
It's lame. And so the timelessness of it is important. So this is powerful, and I'm glad we spoke about this, because this is something that I think has drawn people. It has in the past 2 years, things have happened in the world that are unusual, let us say.
Yeah.
The parishes with the traditional worship were full. They really never lost anybody. And other parishes have lost significant numbers of people. Some estimates 50% in Western Canada. And so 50% of people haven't come back, and 60% of the money hasn't come back either. So there's a lot of topics we could get into, but the main thing is that in the work of or in worship, we are seeing that the timelessness, there's a fundamental truth to that which retains and stays, and this is the positive thing.
Yeah, well said.
So a related question that I was wanting to ask you about is, so Catholics living in the culture today, stepping aside from worship now, but just living their life in the culture, we're finding that many people are coming to us and saying, I'd like to start a business. Well, why? Well, because I have a corporate job, I work in a downtown job, or I work somewhere, and they're increasingly asking me to do things that are inimical to the faith. They're saying, do this, believe that, go to this function, attend this, promote this, support that. And there's an unease, and it's more than an unease. There's real serious pressure, and people have lost their jobs even in recent times for unwillingness to participate in something that the culture wants them to do. Right. Do you see that? What do you see in your vantage point talking to people about just their life as Catholics within the culture in the broader sense?
Yeah, well, over the past, let's say 2 years, I know firsthand of probably 4 or 5 families whose lives have been turned upside down by those kinds of expectations, where they were required to do something that they couldn't in good conscience do.
Yes.
And so they lost their jobs. I know people who left the country over it. Actually, several families who have left the country over it.
Yes.
It's not something I expected to see in my lifetime, to be honest. But now that we are seeing it, I think that we're getting our first dose, our first taste of what it's like to be expected to make a sacrifice, a little pinch of incense towards the emperor.
Burn a grain.
And so we're going to have to start. I'm speaking to church or to Catholics of all shapes and sizes here, and all persuasions. Yes. That we're going to have to, I think, take very seriously what it is that we believe, learn it, study it, be committed to it, and then be prepared to defend it when the time comes. And if we're not, I think the measure of our faith is going to be taken, maybe in small doses like that, maybe in big doses sooner than we expect. There's that famous line by Francis Cardinal George, who was the former Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, who was the Episcopal sort of anointing of Word on Fire, which most people will be familiar with, of course, today. Yes. He had sort of commissioned at the time Father Robert Barron to start doing that work. But he had famously said something like, I will die comfortable in my bed, my successor will die in a jail cell, and his successor will die a martyr's death. And that might be sort of an accelerated timeline, but boy, things do seem to be happening quickly in the culture now. That it's no longer sort of linear. It's becoming much more exponential, and it's been quite terrifying. So God is in control, of course, and we trust in Him to guide His church. But at the same time, we are members of the church, and we have to take responsibility for our own conduct within it.
The geometric progression that you speak of, the exponential nature, it's scary. I mean, same with me. I never expected to see this kind of price to pay. And I wouldn't say that I've paid a great price yet. I've paid a price here and there. Maybe you have as well. Others have. You lose a contract, or somebody doesn't like you anymore, or you lose a friend, or or you're not given a particular opportunity that is out there that you possibly could qualify for, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I see that people are increasingly afraid of that. So we will have to pay a price. And, our Lord said, don't count the cost. But this is the ultimate challenge, I think, in the next years. It's this challenge. And so, what are you saying to people about that at this point in your public life?
Yeah, I'm not saying a lot, to be honest. This is kind of probably the first public conversation I've had about it. I'm trying to counsel friends who are struggling financially or professionally or otherwise.
Yes.
And in fact, I've suggested a few people to look at the Catholic CEO, because several of them have been in positions where they were high-ranking executives who were then pushed out. Well, so these are qualified people. These are capable people.
Yes.
Who, you could go try to find another executive position somewhere, but maybe the time is right for you to go and start your own business. Even Catholic institutions, I'm seeing, like that's primarily who my business caters to. Is it hadn't always. It started off as mostly corporate clients, but as I've become more of a sort of a public personality in the church. I've attracted more kind of Catholic, apostolic, and institutional clients. But even among some of the institutional ones, I had to fire, more recently, because they were saying things and doing things that ethically I just found so objectionable, that I took a financial hit over that. And probably burned some bridges that created enemies within the institution of the church that I would rather not have. But I didn't see any way around that, given the things that they were doing, which I considered harmful to the church. And so, on the one hand, institutionally, we need to get our house in order. We need to have sort of a unified front, because a house divided obviously cannot stand.
Yes.
And you and I can't solve that. That's very much in the hands of the bishops. But in the meantime, for those of us who are among the laity who participate in that aspect of the life of the church, I think initiatives like Catholic CEO are a perfect response to try and build up what you call the Catholic economy, to try and work together and to build opportunities for each other, and then to circulate that wealth internally, so that we don't have to rely on organizations or even institutions that used to provide for us, but now are drawing that line in the sand that we can't cross.
Yeah, it's an interesting viewpoint that we both share, I think, on this one. One of the clients said to me the other day, Catholics are waking up. And I asked her what she meant by that. And she said that Catholics are realizing that, there are powers and authorities out there that will actually prevent us from gaining employment or holding jobs. And so we'll have to become independent. And so as you, at the parish that I'm very close to now, probably 36 people lost their jobs recently. Wow. And so I made an offer to work with them at no cost to the priest. I said, I'll offer to work with these people to start a business. And there's about 30 initially. And I would say that I'm working with 12 people. And so again, not to get into detail, but those 12 people are contemplating starting a job. And each of them has an inherent skill set. They have talents, they have a track record out there in the secular world. And so a number of them have actually done literally a startup in the last 6 months. They're starting a business and they're taking it. The parish itself is helping people to I use the word mildly, it's prepper behavior, like learn how to preserve food, learn how to supply for your family in case your income drops 20, 30, 40, 50% or goes all the way to zero. And so I'm seeing that, and I can see that we've touched a nerve a little bit with the Catholic CEO and the Catholic economy. I'm not here to necessarily promote that only, but that's happening. And so I'm concerned about it, and I see that people increasingly are as well. And so what would you, do you see in the next few years a particular pattern? Will you see this increasing just from your vantage point? And what can you predict for us in a certain way?
Yeah. I mean, I'm reluctant to make predictions. On the one hand, I part of me says I hope not that we see these kinds of problems become bigger and more pernicious. But at the same time, if it's the kind of thing that can help us to wake up, as the person you were speaking with had identified, then maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe that's the kind of thing that we need to galvanize ourselves as a church and as a people of faith, to take more seriously the threats that are out there against us. For my part, you asked me about advice that I might be giving to people who are in this position. I've been able to weather that storm relatively well because I'm independently employed, right?
Yes.
And I would say that, to whatever degree, that's an enviable position to be in. Try to imitate it for those who can go out there and start their own businesses. If you're a skilled person, if you're a self-starter, if you're a hard worker, don't be afraid of it. I mean, if someone like myself can figure out, the ropes to starting a business, and able to invest that effort, then I think that it's now's the time to start exploring those kinds of opportunities. And for some people, they have nothing left to lose. If that means that, again, if these problems kind of persist, and I'm a bit of a pessimist about this kind of thing, I think they will. If that's the kind of thing that will inspire people to be able to generate wealth for themselves that isn't then being distributed into organizations that are working in a way that isn't opposed to the church's life and teachings, then I'd say that's a good thing, even if we have to suffer some pain now to get there.
Yeah, exactly. Many people that I've encountered over, let's say, even the last 10 years have, decided where they're putting their money, as in the sense of discretionary spending, donations and things like that. So they've made decisions and moves already, but now they're finding that they're going to have to focus with their actual job, their own employment. Can I stay at this company? Can I stay at this organization and still live a Catholic life and hold to my beliefs without actually, prevaricating on the job type of thing? And so this is a problem, and it's affecting. It's affecting a broad generation of people. I noticed that young people are increasingly looking at a gig economy or a smaller, kind of more humble and modern. The career goals, at my stage of life when I was in university and so on, everybody was very ambitious and career oriented, it seemed to me, anecdotally. And today it's, the young people are even questioning going to institutions of higher learning, et cetera, et cetera. So this is interesting that we're going through this. Will the church be, it's a rhetorical question, and I'm not here to put you on the spot, but what will happen to the church, the institutional church, during this next, 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's going to shrink. I think that's beyond doubt. Cardinal Ratzinger, or I think he was maybe Father Ratzinger at the time, around the time the council, who we'll all, of course, know as Pope Benedict, had made a prediction that the church would shrink in size, institutionally at least, but the quality of faith among the people who were still there would be quite richer compared to the time he was making that prediction. And I don't know the whole history around the reaction to that, but from anecdotally, I've been told that people thought he was crazy for making that prediction. They just thought, there's this new, the council has just happened. We're rewriting the mass. There's going to be this whole new springtime within the life of the church. So how could that possibly be the case? And of course, his prediction has come true. And then, of course, we saw a crisis of faith and vocations along with it throughout the 80s and 90s. And then, it recovered a little bit, but still not to the degree that was needed, such that now, the generation of baby boomer priests are all going to be retiring, bishops along with them, and there's nobody there to replace them. If most domestic dioceses, at least here in Canada, are relying heavily on foreign priests to fill in those gaps, but that can't go on indefinitely. And a lot of these foreign priests in parishes that I've been in, they're kind of they're sort of stewards who are just sort of filling in as stopovers. They're not really governing the parishes. It's really being governed by parish council types who I mean, that's sort of a false ecclesiology just to begin with, right? I mean, parish council, that's not an authoritative structure by any stretch.
No, they don't, they shouldn't and don't co-govern. That's
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
but in these parishes where you get a priest from India or from Africa or from Poland who's in there for a few years and then gets moved along, who has two bishops that he's answering to and who are moving him around and shuffling him, what it should come as no surprise that they're not trying to govern or really implement anything. They're just there to provide the sacraments for a short stay over, and then they're gone. And so in the meantime, the laity are sort of stepping in and trying to govern, and we're not qualified to do that, and we don't have the charism to do that. And so things aren't going well as a result of that either. The parish that I used to go to, and I'm still a member of, we stopped in there recently. Again, we normally go to the Latin Mass, but we stopped in there for a recent Sunday, and both my wife and I were shocked to see that the attendance was probably down about half of what it used to be on a typical Sunday morning. And this isn't like a small inner city parish. This is one of the affluent suburban parishes.
Yes.
It would have been probably one of the top 3 parishes when I joined it in terms of size, and now is in significant decline from what I can tell. And the demographics were largely elderly attending. Like there was hardly any young families there at the particular Mass that we attended. And I just remember thinking, like, if this goes on much longer, this parish is probably going to be gone in a generation. And if it's going to be gone, then we can imagine that the countless other ones will be gone in the meantime. We don't have the domestic priests to make up for the shortfalls in vocations as well. And a lot of those domestic priests are going to have to become bishops because there's no one else to contend for those roles. So yeah, institutionally, it's going to contract, and what that looks like and how it operates, I mean, it's going to be unprecedented. So I don't know what that's going to look like. But I've had conversations with young priests, and they've said interesting things that they imagine will take place, maybe operating in sort of more of a monastic community, as sort of a community of priests, the few that are there, and then sending them out to different sort of missionary parishes, but not this sort of like parish structure where there's parishes throughout the diocese and they all have a rectory and a priest who is their pastor, but rather sort of these kind of like hives, these monastic hives of priests where they would go out and sort of service the needs of Catholics spread out all over the place. So that could be one thing, but it's going to be a very different church as this sort of generational turnover takes shape. Yeah,
I'm getting a number of comments from people and questions really asking about the laity seems to want to, they're attracted to this hive approach that you've just spoken of. And so there's some people that have specifically said, well, let's move to beside, Clear Creek. There's an abbey there, there's a monastery, or find these places and move there and create Catholic communities and so on. That's all fraught with all sorts of risks and dangers as well. But there's something dynamic happening here, which is interesting for us to all observe. And those, for those who have faith, we need to stay the course, I think is the simple answer. But your perception of it, I think I agree that it will be a smaller institutional church, and the model will have to be different, because you won't be able to have, parish councils. They can help govern the physical plant, the finances, the volunteer structure and so on. But without that central kind of teach, ruling, and sanctifying approach of a priest and the sacraments, it's challenging and it's problematic. So that's not necessarily, we didn't intend to create a downer kind of conversation here, but it's of concern. What's the bright spot on the horizon? Let me ask you that one before we come to the natural end of our discussion today. What are the positives and the bright spots that you see, Brian?
Well, I would return to Pope Benedict's prediction that the quality of faith among the people is going to be much higher and much richer. And so, the contrast of my own experience being the parish that I had joined some 15 years ago or so when I became Catholic was a huge parish. From a Protestant perspective, among the Protestant parishes or churches that I was attending prior to that, it would be something like a mega church, where there's thousands of people. That's one kind of experience that I had. Now going to the Latin Mass, it's a parish of 200 to 300 people, and when we first started going, it was probably closer to 75 to 100. But the richness of community there is just such a beautiful thing to be a part of, and I never would have known until I had experienced it, like how much more I would have desired that smaller, tighter community. But at my old parish, you'd get out on Sunday, you'd gather in the foyer among the people that you're kind of your circle within the broader community.
Yes.
And you'd visit, and then eventually someone would turn the lights out and try to, we're trying to lock up, and you'd feel like you're getting kicked out, right?
Ring you out the door, yeah.
Exactly. Whereas at the Latin Mass chaplaincy that I go to now, we're there for hours and hours after Mass. There's a park across the street. We almost all inevitably go over there. There's dozens of kids playing soccer or climbing on the playground structure, or the hockey rink. In the wintertime, we would all have these big games of shinny hockey. The dads would be in there, the moms would be in there, the kids would all be in there. We'd have like 30 people out on the ice, and it was pure chaos. But it was such a beautiful thing, a beautiful expression of community. And so there's so much more strength in that sort of that tighter expression of the church that I'm enjoying, actually, for the time being. I don't know if it's going to become something where our faith and our resolve is going to be tested through persecution or otherwise. But for the time being, I'm really enjoying that tighter, richer quality of community.
Yeah. I can only agree 100% with you. As a grandfather, I see my grandchildren in both British Columbia, Alberta, and Texas, where I have family. They're all in the traditional communities doing this. That after Mass, it's like it's a destination. You go to Mass and you have benediction or you have adoration, but you have all these other community events. People share things. I mean, there's all kinds of stories we could talk about of how people share from their abundance. Let's say they're farmers or ag people, they bring things to the parish, and so that's building a certain kind of Catholic community that's a little bit different than the popular culture, where everybody just kind of lives in that culture and leaves, like you say, easily leaves the church, and they shut the lights off an hour or 10 minutes after and everybody's gone. It's an interesting thing. Well, Brian, we could talk at length, and we've already come to the natural end, I think, of our hour that we promised each other on this. And I'm grateful that you were able to join us today. And I think that, I'd like to talk with you more about some of these things, because the manifestation, how we do this and how we react to the culture in the future will be very important questions for us all. Where do we find you? What's your information, your contact information? How do we get you if we want to follow you and listen to you?
Probably the easiest way is just to go to my website, which is brianholdsworth.ca. But I'm on YouTube, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. So if you search for me on any of those platforms, you'll find me there.
We'll find you then. That's great. That's great. Well, thanks, Brian. God bless you and your family and all of your works.
Thanks. Same to you, Henry.
God bless. We'll see you. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. Glad you were with us today. See you next time. God bless.